Hello everyone, welcome to this channel. Welcome back to the channel if you're already a subscriber, and if you're not, please consider to subscribe because I'm posting lots of new videos and lots of new content on Jung weekly, and this video is only part of a larger series on the ego, and I think you probably enjoy other videos if you like this. And if you do have any requests for new videos, then please leave a comment below and I'd be curious to hear what you think about this video or about what you want to hear. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So this video will be on the threatening aspects of the ego. So why can the ego become problematic? And precisely what we'll be talking about is the crystallization or the potential crystallizing effects of the ego over time. So that which can subjugate essentially elements that are naturally dynamic into elements that are rigid and unchanging. Now, this is a natural tendency of the ego that always happens, but it can become pathological, let's say, or dangerous or threatening to the development of the psyche as a whole, to the point where it can essentially cause or further the possibility for trauma. Now, the video is split into 5 parts. After this introduction, we'll talk about the natural mechanism of the ego development and essentially the sort of the ego as a mechanism of creating linearity. Then we'll talk about the elements that it subjugates in the process of creating this linearity, so essentially of that which is non-ego. We'll finally talk about the role of the ego, so that which the ego would naturally do, let's say. I always talk about this as the transcendental movement, the ego as a mediator between two realms. And then as a bonus, so stay tuned, we'll talk about social media and the effects of social media on this ego development. So let us get right into it, just noting down timestamps. So the ego is a part of the psychic makeup. For Carl Jung, whom we will argue with in this, the perspective of which we'll argue from in these videos, in this and my other videos, the ego is the central psychic dominance, so the central element within a lot of other complexes, as he calls them, in the psyche as a whole. The ego is the central dominant because it is at the core, if you think about it in the hierarchy, of all the elements. It sort of dictates what the whole is to be thought about as, if you will. So the whole of the psyche, all the other complexes should be thought about as X, Y, Z, and the ego determines this X, Y, Z. So the ego's fundamental function is narration, I say, right? Jung doesn't say this explicitly, but essentially the ego tells the kind of story that you tell about yourself, and then via the personas that you tell to others in a given situation, okay? So this is the fundamental definition. This is how I fundamentally understand the ego. Now, within this process of narrating, the ego necessarily does something that we all do all the time. It reduces complexity. And reducing complexity always means you see something, right? Let's say a ball, a football, and you're like immediately putting it into a box. You say, well, football, play, and mostly, and I think Jung is quite in line with this, you put it in a box that is determined by an action and is referenced to other boxes that you've already referenced within the development of your psyche. So this is strongly related to the personal context, right? Now, there is an element of archetypes in this as well that I'm not going to go into in this video. If you're interested in the archetypes and its interaction with the ego, then please reference other videos on the channel. I'll link some in the description. And if you can't find the relevant videos, then please go to the channel as a whole and subscribe and so on, and you'll have access to all the material. Now, what occurs in this process, right, the football manifesting it in a sort of network or web of other elements that I've already encountered, what happens there is I reduce the complexity of the football in its reality as it is within the non-ego, right? It's out there, let's say. Now, this is not problematic as long as the football stays this way when I encounter it next. Now, let's take a more dynamic example, right? I have my neighbor that I encountered today as a very loving, warm-hearted woman. And I encountered her in 3 days after she murdered her 4 children, right? And in this moment, the image, the sort of manifested representation of my neighbor that I had is shattered. The assumption that I projected into the future, that she will be loving and warm-hearted and kind and so on, is destroyed. It's disrupted. And depending on how fundamental, and I've made a video on trauma, by the way, but depending how fundamental this assumption was, it may be experienced as a traumatic rupture of the entire structure of the ego. Because the ego is based or built on these assumptions, right? You have an assumption about your health, the continuity of your, let's say, social status, the continuity of your partnerships, the continuity of your jobs, occupations, your looks, whatever it is, right? You have all these assumptions. And, and those assumptions spread to assumptions about the world, right? You have an assumption about the peace of the world, and so on and so forth. As soon as those are shattered, something within you gets ruptured, right? And this may potentially be traumatic. But now, about the ego, we now know that the ego attempts to create these assumptions and to project them or extrapolate them into the future, right? Okay. Now, the problem is that the elements that we subjugate, I would say, remain autonomous, right? And this brings us to this non-ego stuff that is out there, right? You essentially have only, and again, I've made a video on this called The Eternal Struggle of the Ego and the Unconscious or something similar. There's essentially only ego and non-ego, because everything that's ego cannot be non-ego, right? The ego has shattered, thrown a light on it, right? It has enlightened, let's say. A light has emerged in that space, so there is light there. We have an idea of it, but this, and this is very important, doesn't mean that we know what it is, right? And so this is a very, very important point. The ego can never indefinitely bring light to any place. Light always has to be rekindled. A candle, a fireplace, right? It stops burning at some point. So you always have to put effort and work into this sort of the maintenance of this fireplace, the maintenance of this light that the ego is shattered. What this means in terms of the ego is that you always have to continue to encounter or to voluntarily submit yourself to the encounter of the elements that you have previously subjugated, and of course of new elements. And this is a lot of work, and this is what we basically do all the time, right? We engage in gossip. We're like, oh, what is Mary doing? What is, whatever, Peter doing these days, and we try to situate ourselves within this interpretation, right? We had an interpretation. Oh, Peter was this guy who had this corporate career and was getting high salary from Boston Consulting, whatever. And now suddenly he's homeless. Like, what the hell's going on? My central assumptions about Peter were wrong, but potentially my central assumptions about the entire system of capitalism were wrong, and so on and so forth. So this is key to understanding the structure, right? The elements that the ego threatens or crystallizes naturally continue to unfold or continue to engage in a process of change. And the ego is not prepared naturally. It's not prepared for the process of this change. So what now is the role of the ego? This brings us to the next chapter. The role of the ego is precisely to move, as I say, up and down the world ladder, to move between, okay, what do I know? What have I already manifested here? And what is really out there, right? And in between those two areas of the world lays what we then call the ego, because that which has already been manifested is not only existing on the level of the personal ego, but on the level of the collective, let's say, conscious, right? It's in books, it's in films, it's in the archives, and we can reference those. And then the ego itself, in the middle between those, right, is what emerges out of this transcendental process. It's this up and down movement in the middle of which we exist constantly and shape and form this world. And now again, this is the ego as process, right? The ego as a narration, as a narrative process. And I'll get into precisely these three world areas in another video because I think there's a lot of confusion about it. But for now we can say our role as subject is precisely to be present within this world and make ourselves present within this world. And now, why is it threatening if we don't do precisely that? It is threatening because the ego will, and I think this is quite obvious from what we said earlier, the ego will be stuck in this self-circled process of crystallization. Oh, I already know what Peter is. He's this guy that X, Y, Z. Well, Peter hasn't been that guy for the past 10 years, right? And this is what happens with parents and children, right? As parents, we have quite a strong view of our children. We know, oh, this little child is X, Y, Z, and he does or she does X, Y, Z. And so the problem is, as the child grows up, they're going to be interested in other things we could have never predicted. I've had this process with close relatives of mine where I'm like, wow, like I barely recognize you, you know, like I don't know who you are, I don't know what you've developed into, not in a negative way, but in a neutral way, non-judgmental way, right? But I've become detached from it. The same goes for institutions. You haven't visited an institution in a couple of years, you'll see that the institution has changed entirely. Or, and this is a negative example, you'll see that the institution has not changed at all. Because it is so rigid, because the institution in its structure can be considered a form of ego or engage in the process of egoification in itself, right? Now, there again, we can only circumvent this process by engaging in precisely this transcendental movement, this mediating movement, by, on the one hand, being concerned with giving back to the culture, while on the other hand, being concerned with encountering that which is unknown. Right? Now, why, and this is the bonus part now, why do I say social media is negative in this regard, right? And I wrote a book on this a while ago, which I attempted to reflect on it. It's called The Broken Psyche. If you're interested in reading it, you can find a link in the description, or you can find a link to the website where you can find the book in the description of the video. But basically, the problem of social media is that it enforces precisely this crystallization. You're supposed to show what you are within the image, the selfie especially. And the selfie is always a persona. And not only a persona, but a multi-reference persona. It's referencing on so many levels, you know, you're like, oh, well, I wanna look like this person, right? So you make yourself look like this person in your clothing, in your hairstyle, in your makeup, but then you also stage yourself like this person within the photo, within the angles, the lighting, and so on and so forth, the filters. And the problematic aspect here is you're not even referencing a single person, but usually you're jointly referencing a group, which then Byung-Chul Han calls filter bubbles, or bubbles of filters, right? And the problematic aspect about this is that these bubbles are not defined by, let's say, the natural occurrence or spontaneous development of the elements within them. So what do I want to be, what do you want to be, and what do we want to be together, but instead by algorithms, right? The algorithms determine the algorithms make filters necessary, and we as humans, because the ego is structured to think in those categories in a way, comply with those structural prerequisites, let's say. Now, this is why in the end, social media then makes us think, or enforces precisely this crystallizing effect, right? It's like, I am this, I am that, and now I have to reinvent myself, but again, in reference to these filters. And it's this vicious cycle that always reinforces this self-sameness, or this, let's say, vortex of alienation, you would say, right? Where the question of the rupture, so the question of the intervention of the other, never really comes to play, right? Because in the process of the ego's development, you always have this encounter with the other. You always have this possibility that the Peter that you've had this thought about actually comes back around and says, hold on, I've actually been fired. You know what I mean? Or that you can actually, that things become so problematic that you have to have a conversation with your child and really encounter them and say, well, I'm meeting you for what you are right here, right in this moment, right? And this chance is sort of taken away on social media because you can always return to a new bubble, to a new space. So it's essentially, it's cutting out this natural process of transcendental, let's say, reinvention of the ego. Okay, great. Thanks a lot for watching. And if you're interested in this channel, again, in the content, there's lots of other videos coming, then please subscribe and please leave a comment and of course leave a like. Thanks a lot.